Hi, my name is Sarah, and I've embarked on a journey to read through all 51 volumes of the Harvard Classics collection. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex as it's also called, which is a very interesting play. So I'm just going to get right into it. Volume 8 of the Harvard Classics is a Greek tragedy, plays, dramas, etc. And it's been a very interesting book. It has 9 different plays in it, and most of them I was not familiar with before picking up this volume. Oedipus Rex and Antigone are the exception to that, and I'll refer to it probably more often as Oedipus Rex because that's how I was told it was the first time I read it in school. But I think the more common name is probably Oedipus the King, and that definitely makes more sense, I think, as a name for this story. Oedipus the King very nearly threw me off of reading Greek stuff altogether when I first read it because it's so unsettling and just shocking, I guess, in its content. And I definitely do not feel like it was a great book for my school to introduce to me as like a freshman in high school. I feel like they could have picked way better options that would not have scared me as much about Greek mythology and Greek literature and all of that. But coming back and reading it with a fresh set of eyes, knowing what happened going in, not being surprised by the twist, and understanding Greek culture, Greek literature, Greek dramas a little more now as an adult than I did when I was a teenager has made me have a new appreciation for this story. As a writer myself, I can appreciate how well fleshed out it is, the character development, the pacing of the story, and the foreshadowing in particular. It's really a masterful story, even though it's not pleasant to read. And I find that to be the case a lot of the time with Greek myths. And personally, I feel like Oedipus the King is at the top of the list. There's a few that are definitely above this on terms of unsettling and unpleasant, but Oedipus the King is definitely up there. So it's not enjoyable, but it is interesting and very masterfully composed. Before I get too far into talking about the content of Oedipus the King, I'm going to talk about Sophocles, who was the writer of the story. Sophocles is considered the most perfectly balanced among the 3 great masters of Greek tragedy, which includes Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, all of whom are included in Volume 8. Sophocles was the only one I had read previously, so it was very nice to be introduced to these other masters of Greek tragedy and Greek drama. But Sophocles, among those 3, is widely considered to be the most well-rounded and to kind of be the greatest of the masters of Greek tragedy, Greek drama. However, I would consider he's the greatest in his own way, and that the other 2 masters are equally great in a very different way. And I definitely found that I really enjoyed Aeschylus, whereas I had never been introduced to him before, so I never would have known that if not for this Harvard Classics. But I found that I really enjoyed Aeschylus and Euripides in their own unique ways, perhaps even more so than I enjoy Sophocles. Sophocles was born in Colonus, near Athens, about 495 BC. His father was wealthy, and Sophocles received the best education of the time, especially in music. He began a career as a dramatist at 27 when he gained a victory over Aeschylus, and from that time until his death in 405 BC, he retained the foremost place as a writer of tragedy. In that time period, in that place, there was a lot of competition involved with being the greatest dramatist, and Aeschylus had held that position for a while, but when Sophocles came along, he overthrew him from that throne, as it were, and he held on to that title of prominence up until his death. Sophocles also, interestingly enough, and something that I found was very commonplace among these dramatists and men of words in this time period, Sophocles served his country as both a diplomat and a general. And so he was not just a man of words, he was also a man of action. His son, Iophon, and grandson, also called Sophocles, which is not confusing at all, both gained reputations as tragic poets in their own rights. So we have two Sophocles who are poets, tragic poets, and that I found to be a little confusing and something that I did not know about. I guess probably in my mind, if I'd seen works from both of those men, I probably would have assumed they were from the same Sophocles. Sophocles Sr. composed 120 plays, 100 of which are known by name, and only 7 of them have come down to us as entire pieces. So, unfortunately, out of all of that great quantity of his plays, we have very few that are surviving today. But something that's really cool about Sophocles' writing, that is something that Aeschylus' writing was lacking in many ways, is that Sophocles made it a priority to make each work its own complete entity that can stand on its own. So, for example, if you think of a book series, if you were to pick up any book in that series, you would be able to read it and understand what was going on and follow the plot and have it be its own story and not be reliant on the other books in that series in order to make sense. So, for example, the Oresteia of Aeschylus is a Greek tragic trilogy, which was very popular. And if you were to take the last book in that trilogy, which I believe was The Furies, if you were to take that last play and read it by itself, all of the context of that play would be missing. You would not know what was going on. Whereas Oedipus the King, which, if my memory serves me correctly, Oedipus the King is the second in this kind of trilogy of sorts that has, I think it's just Oedipus the King, and then Antigone. And Oedipus the King, even though it's kind of in the middle of the story, makes perfect sense all on its own. You don't need to have the prior knowledge of the prior play. You don't need to have the conclusion of Antigone in order to understand what is happening in Oedipus Rex. So it's very self-sufficient, and Antigone is the same way, and so all of Sophocles' plays were made to be able to be enjoyed all on their own. Which is very great because a lot of the Greek tragedies, Greek dramas were lost to time. And for example, Prometheus Bound, which I talked about in my last video of the Harvard Classics, is kind of difficult to understand because you're missing parts. I believe Prometheus Bound was the middle play as well in that case, but you don't really know fully what's happening or what will happen, and you're left on this feeling of incompletion at the end of it because it does not stand on its own as well as something like Oedipus the King. So with a little background on Sophocles, I think it's a little easier to understand the masterful quality of his work, the purpose behind his work, what he was hoping to achieve. He was educated, he was also knew real life scenarios. He was a general, he was a diplomat, he knew people. As a diplomat, he would have had to have a good understanding of how people think and how they function and how to interact with them, how to resolve conflict, things like that, which would add to his writing, which I think is something that all writers should do, is bring their own experiences and their own special talents to their field of writing so that they can share a story that is unique and all the more powerful. So what I've found is easiest to do with these Greek dramas is to kind of just summarize what happens throughout the play. So, spoiler alert, if you have never read or are worried about being spoiled to a story that was written hundreds of years ago, then the rest of this video is probably going to spoil quite a few things about the plot of this story. Oedipus the King, as I said, I'm pretty confident was the second book in the trilogy of sorts. However, all of the three stand on their own as well. In my next video in this collection, I'll be talking about Antigone, which is also included in Volume 8, which is nice because Antigone is one of my favorite of the plays and definitely more enjoyable, I think, than Oedipus the King. So the story of Oedipus the King starts with a plague tormenting the city of Thebes. And the people under Oedipus's kingship are very worried about this because this plague is a serious thing. It's been going on for a long time. And the people are starting to think it's probably the gods causing this plague because they're angry at us for some reason. So we need to figure out what's going on so that we can stop it. So in order to figure out what's going on, Oedipus is like, okay, let's seek help. Let's try to figure out what's happening here. So he sends his brother-in-law, Creon, to the temple of Apollo to learn what might be happening and why the gods are mad at them. So Creon goes to seek the oracle. The story kind of starts with Creon coming back from that journey, and we learn that the news he brings is not good news. Creon brings back the news that they must find and drive out the one responsible for their prior king, Laius's death. The prior king of Thebes, Laius, was killed, and this will be talked about more in this story. And the gods are mad because this murderer of Laius has not faced justice yet. Oedipus calls the people together and commands that anyone who knows information about Laius's death will come forward. And if anyone is aiding and abetting the murderer or hiding information or the murderer himself, they will face great punishment. This is where the common figure, especially in Sophocles, but like kind of all throughout Greek mythology in a way, Tiresias, the blind prophet, makes his appearance. Learning the story of Tiresias from the Ovid's Metamorphosis was very interesting. He has a very interesting backstory that never really gets looked into in the plays that he makes an appearance in, because he's just like this blind prophet and he's being led around and he's telling people of their impending dooms, etc. Which, that's an interesting job description, I guess. But when you learn more about the story of the guy, you are like, yeah, he should be able to just like sit back and tell people about how their lives will be ruined for a change after what happened to him. But I'm not going to get into his specific myth because that's a whole separate story and doesn't really need to be talked about for an understanding of who he is in this narrative. Tiresias, the blind prophet, is called forth to bring any information that he knows. Hopefully he can point out who the murderer is and bring an end to this plague. But Tiresias, when he's brought forth, is like, I don't want to talk. I'm not going to tell you anything. And Oedipus is furious about this and thinks that Tiresias must be aiding the murderer, or Tiresias is responsible in some way for the death of King Laius. Oedipus thinks that Tiresias is also withholding this information because he's plotting, like, against Oedipus, that him and Creon are like working together to overthrow Oedipus from the throne and just generally bring trouble on the people of Thebes. And Tiresias is like, fine, if you're gonna be that way, then I'll tell you what I know, but you're not gonna like it. So Tiresias finally speaks, and he reveals that Oedipus himself is the murderer. Oedipus, of course, denies this and is like, that's impossible, you're a liar. And then he, again, believes that Tiresias and Creon are plotting together to overthrow him. And he's so mad that he just kind of loses all rationality and he just starts insulting Tiresias. He says all this awful stuff about him and Creon, but in particular, relevance to the story. He mocks Tiresias's blindness. He's like, you're just a blind fool. You don't know anything. You can't see anything. And this is really great foreshadowing for what will come to pass in the story later on. Tiresias then kind of holds out and withdraws this information that he knows Oedipus wants. He's like, you don't know who your real parents are, do you? And Oedipus is like, surprised, caught off guard by this information, and demands that Tiresias tell him what he knows. And Tiresias is like, nope, I'm not going to tell you. I just dangled this information in front of you, but I'm not going to tell you because you're not going to like the answer. And this, of course, angers Oedipus, and he's just like fed up with Tiresias at this point, which I could understand. He's like just they're kind of mocking each other in a way in this part of the story. There's also a reason why Tiresias is withholding this information of Oedipus's parentage, which is kind of so that the events that will happen. They're going to unfold as planned by the gods. And so he doesn't tell Oedipus about his parentage, but instead he prophesies that the murderer of King Laius, who is thought to have been a stranger, is actually a native of Thebes, and that murderer will someday be blinded and doomed to wander to foreign lands, and he'll be known to his sons as father and brother, and to his mother as husband and son, and he'll be his father's murderer. So it's kind of this twisted little prophecy that he says, but it really sets up this plot that will unravel throughout the course of this play and slowly reveal information that the reader will understand before the characters in the play themselves do, because they want to deny this information and refuse it so badly, and for good reason too. Tiresias tells Oedipus to think over these things and see if they are untrue. If they are untrue, then he says his gift of prophecy must be gone. If what he's saying is false, then he doesn't have the ability to prophesy anymore. He's going to stake everything about his career as a prophet on this one claim. Oedipus is very upset by this meeting of Tiresias, and he continues to place the blame almost squarely on Creon, because Creon was the one who went to Apollo's temple. Creon was kind of the one that came and fetched Tiresias. This is just working under the assumption that his brother-in-law is out to get him, to throw him from the throne so that he can become king, which Creon does not care at all about. Creon does not want to be king. And as we'll see in Antigone later on, this kind of reluctance that Creon has to become king is kind of veiled to throughout Antigone. And one of Oedipus's main arguments is, if Tiresias knew all of this, why didn't he reveal it sooner? Why didn't he come forward and tell them that he knew information about Laius's murder? And why didn't he say something before Laius was murdered? Why didn't he prevent it? Creon claims that he never desired the throne and urges Oedipus to go inquire of Apollo himself whether he came and told the oracles rightly. Creon is like, if you're so convinced I'm plotting against you, then why don't you go to Apollo, ask him what he told me that I came and told you, and see if it matches up. As Oedipus and Creon are fighting, Jocasta, the wife of Oedipus and the sister of Creon, appears and tries to reason with them, but Oedipus insists upon exiling Creon. He's like, the only way to deal with this guy is to just get rid of him. And Jocasta is like, you're being ridiculous, stop it. But she reveals to Oedipus that a oracle did come to Laius, that Tiresias and Creon weren't just like hiding this information. An oracle did come to Laius that he would die by his own son's hands, and Jocasta claims that the oracle failed because Laius cast the child away, and the rumor went that he was killed instead by robbers. So Jocasta's like, this oracle is false. This prophecy that Tiresias said is false. All prophets are false. Because her husband received this information that was like, your son is going to kill you. And so Laius killed the son. And then the story goes that instead of how Laius died was because he was attacked by a band of robbers on the road, and that's how he died instead of by his son's hands, thus making Tiresias's prophecy void and making the prophecy that Laius had first received void. However, this information does not calm Oedipus as Jocasta had hoped. Instead, Oedipus becomes fearful at learning this and asks the time and place of Laius's death. So Oedipus's mind is working now. He's a little unnerved. He doesn't know what's happening. And Tiresias has put him on edge. So now he's like paranoid and he wants more information about Laius's death. He also wants to know what Laius looked like. And when he receives the answer to his questions, he's overcome. Oedipus is desperate to learn what really happened, so he sends for the last living witness of the attack on Laius. One of his servants, I believe, survived and was able to flee bearing the news that Laius had died. Oedipus then reveals to Jocasta why her news troubles him so much, because when he was younger, he believed that he knew who his parents were, but as he was older, someone in his parents' kingdom court, his adoptive parents, claimed that he was like a changeling and that he was not actually their son. So Oedipus was like, whoa, because everything he believed he knew was called into question. So he went to seek answers from the god Pytho, who told him that he would be guilty of incest and murder his father. Because of this news, Oedipus fled from his home, believing that the oracle meant his current father and mother, who he believed to be his father and mother. But he reached the spot where Laius was killed, and at the spot, Oedipus knows that he killed a group that was passing by, and Oedipus believes that this may be the same group. He realizes that he is the recipient of the curse that he laid. He laid this curse on whoever was responsible for Laius's death, and now he realizes that he is the one that is responsible for that. A messenger chooses this time to arrive and kind of throw things further into disarray. The messenger arrives and explains that Polybus, who was the man who raised Oedipus, who was a king, died by natural causes. And Jocasta claims that this is another example of the oracle's failing, because the king who was Oedipus's father, Oedipus believed he would murder his father, and that king has just now died of natural causes instead of being murdered. The messenger reveals that Oedipus was not the true son of Polybus, but that he was found injured as an infant. And the shepherd who gave the infant to the messenger reveals that the child was given to him by Jocasta for fear that Laius would kill him. So it's further unraveling here. We have all of the pieces are starting to come together. Jocasta, whose husband, King Laius, found out that he would be killed by his son, wanted that son dead. Jocasta, fearing for her son's life, sent him into exile instead. She sent him with the shepherd, who then passed him off to the servant of King Polybus. And this child had he was crippled in the feet by his father, who planned to kill him, and Oedipus has the same infirmity, and that was how this infant was found and taken to Polybus. Polybus and his wife raised Oedipus as their own. This oracle that Oedipus received, where he believed he would kill his father and have incest with his mother, was not talking about King Polybus and his wife, but Oedipus's true mother and father. Jocasta flees the scene of this, distraught, obviously, and later on, as this conversation is unfolding and Oedipus is realizing the gravity of what has happened to him and what he has done, another messenger comes and reveals that Jocasta has killed herself out of sorrow, and Oedipus had been planning to kill her himself for what she had done and what had happened between them. But when he sees her, he takes the clasps from her cloak. He's so distraught. He takes the clasps from her cloak and pierces his own eyes, blinding himself. He's like seen the shame of his mother. He's killed his father. He blinds his eyes that have sinned unwillingly. Oedipus then is led out of the castle and stands before all of his people and reveals his reasoning for blinding himself. And he explains that he plans for a self-imposed exile, that he will leave Thebes and exile himself for his crimes. Because this is what he said would happen to whoever murdered Laius, and Oedipus knows the guilt of what he has done. Oedipus only makes one request of Creon, who is now the new king in his place, and that is that he would be allowed to touch his daughters' faces one more time and just kind of say goodbye. The last lines of the play read, "From hence the lesson draw, to reckon no man happy, till ye see the closing day, until he passes the bourne, which severs life from death, unscathed by woe." So the theme of this play kind of is like, don't think anybody to be happy until they're gone and dead. Don't think them to have a good, happy life until that life is over and you can look back at all of it. Because what may seem like good, happy life leading up throughout their life may crumble suddenly, and those good things may be painted in a negative light when you're looking back at them. So that is the twisted story of Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King. Antigone takes up kind of where that leaves off, and it's just a very interesting story, and I'm excited to talk about that one. But I did think the foreshadowing of this drama is just unparalleled. It's got fantastic foreshadowing. It's got like these kind of twists and turns where you unearth even more information that you would never expect, and it just makes the story very fleshed out and like well thought out from start to finish. So it's a very masterful work. It's not pleasant to read at all. That is Oedipus the King. If anybody has read it, let me know what you think. Let me know what your favorite of the Greek dramas are, if you have one. And if you had a traumatic high school experience with any particular book. I had several, but Oedipus the King was definitely on that list. I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for more videos about the Harvard Classics, and if you like this video, please like and subscribe for more content like this. See you in the next video.